All right, here now to break all of this down, let's welcome in legal analyst and trial attorney Misty Marris. Misty, great to see you. A lot of restrictions today in court. No cameras in there, the embargo on that juror. We know that the judge did examine that juror today. The rest of the jurors will go through the same process next week. What does that examination actually entail?
So the judge it was very clear that this is a very, very narrow inquiry. And the inquiry relates directly to what did Becky Hill say to any of these individual jurors? So the first is, did she have communications with them? What were the nature of those communications? Did those communications relate to the trial? And then the questions could go further than that, depending on the responses. You know, if a juror says, I never had a communication with her outside of her saying good morning, well, then the inquiry might be able to stop there. So it's really going to be dependent. But it's really important to realize that there are very strict limitations on how far the questioning can go. And that's because every state and the federal law has a rule that says in questioning a verdict or the veracity of a verdict, you can't get into juror deliberations. Jurors have to be free to deliberate in that jury room. So the judge is not going to ask questions about the actual deliberations. It's going to relate directly to anything said by Becky Hill and determination of whether that was improper.
You know, and Missy, why do you think the judge is putting so many restrictions on this?
So one of the reasons is to avoid that pitfall relating to the juror deliberations. But the other piece is anything outside of this is irrelevant to the inquiry at hand. And the inquiry is, did Becky Hill engage in conduct that would qualify as jury tainting or impropriety with the jury? The next step is, if the answer is yes, did those communications by Becky Hill actually have an impact on the verdict? So that's the two-prong analysis the judge will ultimately have to determine. In order to do so, the judge has said, we're going to interview on the stand under oath every juror who was part of the deliberations. We're not going to talk to the alternates because they weren't part of the verdict. And then, of course, the testimony of Becky Hill, who submitted an affidavit denying. And then based on all of that, the judge will make the determination. Anything outside of that, Nicole, whether or not Becky Hill engaged in this conduct and that's violative of court rules, violative of the law, potentially criminal, whatever it might be, that's not the inquiry for this particular hearing. That's why it's so narrow.
All right. So my next question then, Missy. So what if the judge decides that it did in fact happen? Does it mean that there's automatically a new trial, or are there any other steps?
If that's prong one, that the communications did happen and the communications were improper, prong two is, did that matter for the verdict? Did that sway the verdict in any way for any one of those individual jurors? And if the answer to that question is yes, the next step, Nicole, believe it or not, because we all watched the Murdaugh trial, it would be a new trial.
A new trial.
That would be enough to overturn the verdict. But it is a high burden. So we'll have to see what comes out. Right now, embargo, we only know 7 questions. That's because the judge did not want the witnesses to be tainted when they come in on Monday, when the hearing officially starts. But we're going to learn a lot more next week.
Yeah, we certainly will. You know, and Miss, you mentioned the fact that we were all watching that trial. It was such a dramatic trial. We're talking about crying, lots of emotions from Murdaugh once he took this stand. Do you think his defense team would use a different strategy if this does in fact go to trial again?
If this were to go to trial again, Nicole, it would be what's called de novo. So it would be from anew. So all the evidentiary rulings that happened in that case would be wouldn't even stand. So we would be coming into this trial for the prosecution and the defense with whatever the judge in this particular case is going to admit. So it could be very different than the case we saw before. One thing I do think, his team has gotten a lot of feedback on what really drove that verdict, both public opinion and some of the jurors who've spoken out. And that was his testimony.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, if this case were to go back into the courtroom and we were to see another trial, would he say, I'm not going to take the stand?
And obviously, we don't know what's going to happen. Let's say there were a new trial. I would imagine that means new jurors would have to be chosen, or would it be the same pool?
Nope, brand new jurors, brand new trial. We don't, some of the evidentiary decisions might not be the same. There could be evidence we saw in trial one that doesn't come into the courtroom in trial two. Both sides, prosecution and the defense, have some ability to do a postmortem, right? To look back on how the trial unfolded and maybe try and correct some of what went one way or the other against their argument. So there's a benefit to it, but by the same token, it's also difficult. Be difficult to impanel a new jury on this case that
Yeah.
hasn't been tainted. There'd certainly be hurdles. We're a few steps away from that right
Yeah.
now, but this hearing next week is definitely going to be interesting.
All right, so let's focus on the step we're on right now. Obviously keeping in mind that we don't know what happened inside that courtroom today, but how often do judges rule in favor of a defendant in these types of cases? And how likely do you think it is that the judge will rule in favor of Murdaugh?
So judges do not like to second guess a jury's verdict. And that's true of both judges in a proceeding like this, as well as in the appellate process. They really don't want to overturn the will and the jury's verdict. And, these are a jury of your peers that had made a determination based on all of the evidence. It's a high bar to overturn that determination. But one thing that stands is that there has to be due process. There has to have been a fair trial. And oftentimes, cases that you do see overturned relate to those types of inquiries. So this case is really dependent on exactly what these jurors heard from Becky Hill, the nature and extent of whether or not there was impropriety. Nicole, if it's true, if a juror says, Becky Hill said, do not believe Alex Murdaugh, as the defendant's petition states, well, that's serious.
Right.
That is misconduct. So it's really just going to depend on the severity. And then the second part, did it even matter? So the judge is going to inquire on that front. And guess what? That judge is going to do a lot of assessment on credibility.
All right, well, we'll see what happens next week. Misty Marris, thank you so much.
Thank you.